Turning now to Iowa, a half dozen Democrats there are competing to run against incumbent Governor Kim Reynolds. Reynolds, a Republican former lieutenant governor, took over last year after President Trump tapped then-Governor Terry Branstad to become the U.S. ambassador to China. According to a new poll by the Des Moines Register and Mediacom, retired businessman Fred Hubbell has an 11-point lead with 2 weeks to go until the June 5th primary. Public opinion researcher Ann Selzer conducted this poll of 500 likely Iowa Democratic primary voters. She joins me now to discuss what she learned from her polling. All right, so Ann, Fred Hubbell has the most support from Democratic primary voters at this point, but he still has less than the 35% he would need to clinch the primary on Election Day, June 5th. How far is this race from being settled?
Oh, this race is still very soft. Fred Hubbell does have an 11-point lead, and that sounds like a pretty big lead. But primaries tend to gel really rather late. So there's still a large group of people, over 20%, almost 30%, who say they don't have a first choice candidate. And even among those who have landed on a candidate, there still is a sizable majority who said they could still be persuaded to vote for somebody else. So there's still a lot of room for the field to shift.
Well, what are the ideological differences, Ann, between Fred Hubbell and his closest competitors, State Senator Nate Bolton and Union Leader Kathy Glasson?
Well, Nate Bolton and Kathy Glasson have something in common, and that is that they both have union ties. And so they might be taking votes away from each other a little bit there. Fred Hubbell has had a major union endorsement, so he's playing to that crowd as well. You know, Fred Hubbell has never held elective office, so that's something that sets him apart. But he has worked in government as more like a volunteer and has some breadth of experience that way. What Nate Bolton is doing, when you look at the demographic profile, is drawing independents into this race. So they are more than 1 in 5 of the people who say they're likely to vote, definitely will vote in this primary, and he is attracting a good share of them. So he's functioning a bit like a Bernie Sanders. Fred Hubbell is doing well, especially with sort of the traditional Democratic profile.
Interesting. Well, the likely Democratic voters in your poll overwhelmingly said that Hubbell has the best chance to beat incumbent Governor Kim Reynolds in November. What does that tell you about his level of support compared to the other candidates?
Well, what we went and looked at was, of course, when everybody was asked that question, who has the best shot at beating Kim Reynolds in November, they most commonly named their first choice candidate. But Fred Hubbell, most consistently with every single candidate, was the one that they named second. So there isn't, sometimes you see kind of a pairing up, so you might think that Nate Bolton's supporters would go with Kathy Glasson or vice versa as the one most likely to win if it's not their candidate. But the supporters of every candidate, if they didn't name their own candidate, they named Fred Hubbell. So that's a sign of some hidden support there.
Well, based on your polling, what issues, Ann, are most important to Iowa's Democratic voters?
Well, we tested, I think, about 10 issues and said you can see this as a major threat to the future of Iowa, a minor threat, or really not much of a threat. And for all but 2, majorities considered these a major threat. At the top of that list were cuts to funding to education. By far at the top of the list, but second were health-related concerns. So Governor Branstad and Kim Reynolds as lieutenant governor were on deck when the Medicare services were privatized, and that's been a very controversial move. So problems with providers getting paid, with people who are on Medicaid, getting services, needed services. So that's also a key issue. Mental health care, especially in rural areas, a big concern. Affordable health care, a concern there too. So those are really at the top of the list, but there were others that a majority said were a concern.
Well, as a state, Iowa has moved to the right since it voted to elect Barack Obama as president twice. Do you see evidence that this trend is continuing, or is the state swinging back to the left?
Well, just to illustrate how far that swing went, when Barack Obama won in 2008, he took about half the counties. He won in about half of the counties, and won by a considerable margin here. When Donald Trump won, there were only 5 or 6 counties that the Democrat Hillary Clinton won. So that's quite a change in terms of being more like a red state. We're right in a very difficult place to see exactly how that tide might be turning. We look at a Democratic primary, we'll obviously look at the turnout there, but the fact that we've got 6 people in this race wanting to take this on says that there certainly is some activation in the Democratic base.
All right, we'll be watching Iowa closely. Iowa public opinion researcher Ann Selzer. Ann, thanks very much for your time.
My pleasure.